Hello, this is Dr. James Camp at Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my introduction to anatomy and physiology, sometimes called the twin sciences, though as you'll see, they are quite non-identical twins. How do we know the difference between anatomy and physiology? How do we know what each one studies? Well, oftentimes people say anatomy studies structures and physiology studies functions, but let's see to what extent that's true. Let's start with the idea of what the words themselves can tell us. Ana is Greek for moving apart or up, and tomia is Greek for the cutting action. So anatomy, in other words, means cutting apart. In this particular case, it means cutting apart of the body. So we can tell that it's a science of body parts, of what you get when you cut apart the body. On the other side, physis means nature, and logos is a Greek word that has lots of meanings, including words, thoughts, philosophies, both words and the thoughts that the words express. So we know that physiology, physis logos, is thoughts about nature. So this is the science of natural things. I thought that was biology. Well, okay, we need a better definition. What does Webster's dictionary say? Webster says anatomy is a branch of structural biology that deals with the structure of organisms. Okay, so we're back to that idea, anatomy studies structure. It's the science of body structures. Physiology, Webster says, is a branch of biology that deals with the functions and activities of life or of living matter and of the physical and chemical phenomena involved. So again, we're back to this idea of functions. Physiology then is the science of body functions. So what do anatomists and physiologists really do? Anatomists study the overall markings and regions of the body, while physiologists study the overall functions of the body as a whole. That much is probably pretty obvious. Anatomists study locations, shapes, and structures of individual organs. So where is the heart found, and what is its overall shape, and what parts does it have? Physiologists study the detailed functions of each body system and individual organ. So they would be more, a physiologist would be more interested in what the heart does in its location than what its particular shapes and structures are. Anatomists study the tissue patterns and cell structures of each organ. Physiologists study the chemical and cellular details, mechanisms that explain each function. So here we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of what we'll really study in physiology for a lot of these systems in this class is the actual chemical or cellular explanations for how a muscle contracts or a nerve fiber sends a signal. And finally, anatomists study how each structure relates to its function. This is a science called functional anatomy. A lot of people think that as soon as you start talking about functions, you're in physiology, but that's not really true. In order to understand the biceps muscle of the arm, for example, you've got to know what its function is, which is to flex the arm, or to flex the forearm, really. Physiologists, on the other hand, study how each function helps the body maintain homeostasis or respond to challenges, or maybe both. Now, are anatomy and physiology completely separate sciences? Of course not. We just talked about the fact that functional anatomy is really kind of a branch of anatomy, even though it's talking about functions. Well, physiology and anatomy are considered twin sciences because really the anatomy and the physiology of most body parts are linked. In order to do a function, you need to have a structure. And in order to understand the structure, you need to know its function. Why? Well, there's a common saying, form follows function. Form or structure follows function, what it does. This can be clearly seen when we study the bones later in anatomy, where we're going to see that the bones are not perfectly smooth. They're not like a little dog bone that you buy at the store. They contain bumps, depressions, roundings, holes. And to understand each of these things really requires some knowledge of the fact that each one of these protrusions or depressions on the bones serves a function. Okay? Bumps are often attachment points for ligaments or tendons. Depressions may be a hollow space for another organ to fit in. Rounded areas are often part of a joint that needs to move smoothly. And finally, holes or notches are almost always there for something to move through them, whether it be a blood vessel or a nerve or a tendon or ligament or muscle. But there's a caveat to this. Not every form has a present-day function. Can you think of some part of the body that doesn't seem to do anything useful? The issue here is that evolution is very good at adding new features that we need. Okay? If a human being needs to walk on two legs in order to survive, then we'll develop the structures we need to do that. If humans need a bigger prefrontal cortex in our brains to socialize with other humans, we'll develop that. And if we don't, we'll probably not survive, or even if we do survive, we won't reproduce successfully. But evolution is pretty lazy about removing features that we no longer need. A classic example of this is that we have this perfectly useless tailbone called the coccyx. Do we have a tail anymore? No, but we have a tailbone. In fact, our embryos grow a complete tail and then reabsorb it into the embryo and just leave the tailbone. But the tailbone has stuck around with us for millions of years after our species gave up having a tail. Now, I don't know about you, but I think it would actually be kind of cool to have a tail. I mean, have my tail hold my grocery bags while I open the car or something like that. Okay. But I don't have a tail, but I still have a tailbone. Note also that not every form is a perfect fit for its function. Evolution often works by editing features we already have to work just well enough rather than adding new features that work perfectly. A classic example of this, still staying in the skeleton, is the human spine, which is based really on a quadruped design. Our spines are not very different from the spines of animals that walk on all fours. While our spine has adapted to work well enough at keeping us on 2 feet, how many people do you know that have back problems? It's a design that has some problems. Okay, so now that we understand what anatomy is and what physiology is and the link between the two, let's take a little detour to talk about the types of things that anatomists might study and the types of things that physiologists might study. Anatomists might study gross anatomy, which not ooh yuck gross like a 5th grader would say, but gross as in the idea of something gross is big. Okay, so gross anatomy is the study of structures large enough to be visible to the eye. Microscopic anatomy, on the other hand, is the study of structures small enough that you need a microscope to see them. What kinds of things do we study in gross anatomy? Well, we might study the surface of the body, surface markings and surface landmarks and body regions. We've already done some of that in this class. We might study regional anatomy, where we say, well, what are the structures that make up the head? Well, it's got eyes and ears and a nasal cavity and an oral cavity and a cranial cavity. And how do these things interact with each other? How do the cranial nerves cross from the cranial cavity to the face, and so forth and so on. Or we might study sectional anatomy. This was once upon a time purely an academic discipline. If you have a person's head and you slice it like this, or if you have a person's body part and you slice it like this, what are the parts that you see? How does that help you understand how everything relates to each other? But in an age where we have MRIs and CT scans and all of these things that take virtual cross sections through somebody's body, sectional anatomy has suddenly become a really applied field. Systemic anatomy is kind of the sort of anatomy we'll be practicing in this class, where you split the body up into a bunch of systems and you study the anatomy of an entire system at one time. And finally, organ anatomy. Pretty much any of the approaches that you take, whether it's regional, sectional, or systemic, at some point you're going to get down to trying to figure out which organ you're looking at and what the structures are within a particular organ. Microscopic anatomy, we've also got a few options. We can dive all the way down to the cell level and study cytology. This is the study of the shapes and structures of individual cells, and sometimes even the things inside those cells, the organelles within the cell. Histology is the study of tissues. Tissues are made up of multiple cells and also several other components like protein fibers. So histology is using a microscope to understand what tissues make up an organ, how they're arranged perhaps into layers or into regions. And then that brings us up to the microscopic version of sectional anatomy, which is to say whenever you're looking at a microscope slide of an organ, you're looking at an organ that has been sectioned into a very thin slice that can be put on a microscope. And so ultimately, all microanatomy becomes sectional anatomy, at least the way we approach it in this class. Okay, we now understand that there are lots of ways to approach anatomy. How about physiology? Well, physiology is not organized into subfields the same way as anatomy. We don't have gross physiology and microphysiology. We don't have regional physiology versus, sectional physiology. We have physiology. Some physiologists are going to focus on a topic. A physiologist might study, for example, the effect of a new blood pressure medication. But blood pressure affects not just the heart, but also the kidneys. And the heart and kidneys have effects on blood pressure. So trying to study blood pressure requires studying one effect across multiple systems. Or someone might be interested in the causes of osteoporosis in postmenopausal women. Calcium in bones certainly seems like a skeletal system problem, right? But menopause involves hormones, so that's endocrine. But the hormones come from the reproductive system. And the calcium that is being removed from the bones also involves the kidneys and the digestive system to replace that calcium. And there are a number of systems that get involved in studying this one simple problem. Other physiologists, on the other hand, study all the functions and disorders of one particular organ system. These are people who you tend to find in clinical practice. You'll find a cardiologist or a neurologist or a gastroenterologist. Most doctors who specialize in one field of what we would call systemic physiology. Some physiologists are going to study the gross effects of organ function on the organ or the body as a whole. So, for example, a sports and exercise physiologist might study how muscle fatigue develops and how to prevent it at a whole organ level. An endocrinologist might be interested in how a particular hormone affects its list of target organs, and for how long, and how you would diagnose that, how you would understand the symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. Other physiologists, the ones who are more involved in academic research, I suppose, zoom in on the cellular or biochemical mechanisms that explain a function. So they're not interested in whole muscle fatigue. They're interested in the nitty-gritty details of how a molecular motor within the muscle fiber causes the muscle to get shorter, to contract. They're not interested in the effect of the hormone on the whole body. They're interested in the effect of the hormone within an individual cell. Okay, we'll talk about physiology at both of these levels throughout this class. We'll talk about the gross effects of muscle fatigue and of hormone actions on the body, but we'll also get into these ideas of the cellular and biochemical mechanisms, because you can't understand modern medicine and the drugs that we use and the way they work without some understanding of what's going on inside your cells with all of these interactions. But all physiologists do have kind of a common toolkit in terms of the questions they ask, whether they're looking at one system or all the systems, whether they're looking at gross physiology or microphysiology. They might ask, how is homeostasis of something, calcium, blood pressure, maintained? How does the bone respond to changes in calcium? How does the heart respond to changes in blood pressure? How does the heart respond to changes in the exercise demand of your body? Those are other, less homeostatic changes. They also want to know another pair of questions. How is a particular activity controlled? How do we know when to contract a muscle and when not to? How do we know when to speed up the heart rate and when to slow it down? And how does that organ get the energy it needs to function? What feeds a hungry muscle or a hungry nerve? And finally, there are physiologists who almost all physiologists at some point ask the question, well, how does my body part get sick? What is the pathophysiology of the heart or the bones or any of these other organs?